Hello, and welcome to the webinar, What You Must Know About Preventing Sexual Abuse. My name is Tina Langlois, and I am General Counsel with the College of Medical Radiation and Imaging Technologists of Ontario. We have launched this webinar in conjunction with the recently revised publication, What You Must Know About Preventing Sexual Abuse, which was sent to you just a little while ago. And we're hopeful that this webinar will provide some context and background information that will help in the understanding and usefulness of that What You Must Know About publication. Today, it's my hope that I'll be able to give some background as to why sexual abuse is an issue in healthcare and what our members need to know about the provisions of the legislation that apply to them that relate to sexual abuse. So first, let's start with a little bit of context and background. The sexual abuse of patients by healthcare professionals is not new. Patients are vulnerable, and healthcare professionals have a significant imbalance of power as it relates to their patients. However, the incidence of sexual abuse of patients was never really studied until the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario struck a task force to really look into the incidence of sexual abuse in their profession, as well as the impact on victims and how the college was managing complaints and concerns of sexual abuse of patients. So the task force did its work, and in 1991 issued its final report. The chair, Mary Lou McPhedran, issued an extensive report that contained some pretty damning evidence that the sexual abuse of patients by doctors was far more prevalent than perhaps first imagined. The impact was devastating on patients and their families, and the college was not handling concerns and complaints of sexual abuse in an appropriate manner. And so the task force report made a number of recommendations related to sexual abuse of patients by healthcare professionals that they suggested would improve the landscape. And at the same time, as luck would have it, the Regulated Health Professions Act was being developed as a blanket piece of legislation that was going to apply to 21 health professions. And so the government of the day saw an opportunity to take the recommendations of the task force report and embed them in the new legislation so that things could be improved not only for patients of physicians, but also for patients of every other health professional that was going to be regulated under that piece of legislation. So the Regulated Health Professions Act came into effect in 1993, and it contained a number of provisions relating to preventing the sexual abuse of patients by health professionals. And in fact, it also included a clause that made quite clear what the purpose of those provisions was intended to be, just in case it was lost on anyone. And this is what it says, that the purpose of the provisions in the legislation that relate to sexual abuse of patients are aimed at encouraging the reporting of such abuse, because the report certainly found that sexual abuse was underreported for a number of reasons. These provisions are aimed at ensuring that there's funding for therapy and counseling for victims of sexual abuse. And then at the end of the day, the provisions are really aimed at eradicating the sexual abuse of patients by members. Perhaps a lofty goal that not achievable, but as much as possible, that's where we're trying to head. And since 1993, there have been additional reports done by Mary Lou McPhedran each time consistently into how these provisions have been protecting the public, whether they have had the impact that the government intended them to have. And in many cases, it was found that they simply did not go far enough. And so the legislation has been amended a few times since it was first brought in to actually bolster the provisions related to preventing sexual abuse of patients. So the kinds of things that have changed over time is There has been an increase in the mandatory penalties for more types of sexual abuse broadly, including mandatory suspension for any kind of physical sexual abuse, and mandatory revocation for frank acts of sexual abuse or for convictions of certain criminal provisions related to sexual abuse. And then again, another change that was made is prevents regulators under the Regulated Health Professions Act to use gender-based restrictions to for their members. So for instance, it was quite common in the past for a physician who was accused of sexual abuse to be restricted to only seeing male patients or something of that nature. And the subsequent reports have found that those gender-specific, gender-based restrictions are do not go far enough to protect the public and are problematic in and of themselves. So regulators no longer have access to that kind of a restriction as it relates to sexual abuse. So let's talk about what exists now in the practice for MRITs that they need to be aware of in terms of sexual abuse prevention. And so we'll start with the Regulated Health Professions Act, which, as you know, is the blanket legislation that now governs 29 regulated health professions. So significant increase since 1993. And there's a few things that the RHPA does related to sexual abuse. So first of all, it defines sexual abuse. And we will go into that a little into more detail later in the webinar, but the definition is really important to understand because it's quite a bit broader than folks probably would imagine it is. The RHPA also establishes that sexual abuse of patients is professional misconduct. As I mentioned, it imposes some mandatory penalties for various types of sexual abuse, and it requires members to make mandatory reports when they have information related to sexual abuse. So that's the real framework of the legislation that applies, and we will go through the various provisions of that legislation. But in addition to the legislation, members of the CMRITO also have some standards that apply directly to preventing sexual abuse of patients. And two specifically that I'm going to talk about today is Standard 1, which relates to legislation, standards, and ethics. And what that standard says is that MRITs must understand and adhere to the legislation governing the practice of the profession, the standards of practice set by the college, and the code of ethics. And we'll talk about each of those things. But basically, that's a pretty straightforward standard that says that our members need to comply with all of those things. And as I've just mentioned, the Act quite clearly states that sexual abuse is professional misconduct and is not tolerated. And so that's where we begin. And then the CMRITO also has a standard that is specifically talking to our members' relationship with their patients. And so that's another area that speaks directly to members preventing sexual abuse. So that standard says that MRITs must maintain clear and professional boundaries in relationship with patients and treat all their patients with dignity and respect. So that's the overarching requirement. And then there are some indicators that also relate specifically to preventing sexual abuse and provide some really helpful guidance to members in terms of the things they need to keep in mind and do when they are encountering patients through the procedures that they do perform. And so here's some of the indicators that really are germane to the sexual abuse prevention realm. Providing clear and understandable information to the patient before, during, and after the procedure. That's a requirement for our members. And that's how to really get around any miscommunication about what's going to happen and what will happen through the procedure. So that's pivotally important. It includes answering any questions folks may have and referring any questions that are outside a member's scope to an appropriate individual. In most cases, it would be the ordering physician or other healthcare professional. Members are also required to carry out procedures only with the informed consent of the patient. And as we know, informed consent is not a form and it's not a point in time. And so patients can withdraw their consent at any time. And so that just speaks to the need to continually communicate with the patient throughout the procedure, before the procedure, after the procedure, so that they understand exactly what's going on, what's expected of them, and what will happen, so that they can consent to that happening. That's what informed consent means. Members are required to treat their patients with dignity and respect in accordance with a code of ethics. Again, just repeating that value that's so very important in our profession. These following ones really are sort of more risk prevention, I would say, in the area of sexual abuse prevention. So the first is to instruct patients to remove only the clothing that will interfere with the procedure. So in other words, don't have someone disrobe completely if that's unnecessary for the particular examination that you will be doing. You need to provide the patient with a gown or a sheet to cover areas where clothing is removed. While you as a healthcare professional might be very comfortable with the human body, you have to remember that patients are going to have varying levels of comfort in terms of being disrobed, and they're already vulnerable in their position as a patient. And so you have to be very clear and provide them with the robing and draping as may be necessary for things that they remove. The next one is so important. Members are required to explain to patients when and where they're going to touch them and why. So give that patient an understanding of why your touch, your physical contact with their body is important to the procedure so that they don't misinterpret it as being something it is not. Everyone comes to you with a different context, a different background, and different life experience. And so you need to be aware that some individuals might be very, very sensitive to others making physical contact with them, may not be comfortable with that, and may ask you not to do that. Make no assumptions in that regard. And then finally, touch the patient only in those areas needed to facilitate and carry out the procedure you're performing. And that's important because when we get to the definition of sexual abuse, there's a distinction between what is something of a sexual nature, touching of a sexual nature, and touching of a clinical nature. So it's really important that the touch you are engaging in with a patient is appropriate and clinically required for the procedure you are carrying out. Because you don't want there to be any misunderstanding. Now let's talk about the Code of Ethics a little bit. It was mentioned in the standard, and it was mentioned in the standard related to relationship with patient as well. So what does the Code of Ethics say? The CMRITO Code of Ethics sets out an MRIT's responsibilities to their patients, and that includes upholding the principle of informed consent. Again, reminding ourselves that everyone has bodily autonomy and the right to refuse service if they wish. And forcing people to do something they're not comfortable with will not end well, ever. We ask that our members obviously respect the dignity, privacy, and autonomy of the patient. That's all included. And then maintain clear and appropriate professional boundaries in your member-patient relationships. So blurring those lines between personal and professional relationships is really problematic and an area of risk. After the legislation came into effect, the CMRITO looked at the practice of its members and decided to adopt a zero tolerance policy as it relates to sexual abuse. And what does that mean? So that means that acts of sexual abuse are not acceptable and won't be tolerated, that any allegation of sexual abuse will be investigated. The college recognizes the extent of the injury that sexual abuse causes to both patients and people around them. College recognizes that its members deal with a very diverse patient population. And in light of the very broad definition of sexual abuse, which includes the qualifiers of a sexual nature in a few places, our members need to appreciate that what constitutes sexual nature will depend on the individual patient experience. And there is no hard and fast line in the sand. The patient gets to define what they are and are not comfortable with, and that is going to be different from patient to patient. And you need to accept that in order to be able to prevent sexual abuse and avoid complaints and concerns being raised. Finally, the zero tolerance policy states that MRITs have to be sensitive to the needs of their patients. And if a patient is uncomfortable with the words or behavior that an MRIT is using, then the MRIT needs to change their words and behavior, because the comfort is in the hands of the patient and they get to decide what they're comfortable with. So every patient's going to be different and every encounter is going to be slightly different. Okay, let's get down to the definition because it is really important. And as I mentioned earlier, it's quite a bit broader than I think most people would assume when they hear the word sexual abuse. Often they think of sexual assault in sort of the criminal context, and it's quite a bit broader than that. And so since sexual abuse is professional misconduct, all of these things are, by definition, professional misconduct and could lead to very serious penalties. So the first one's not going to be surprising. Sexual intercourse or other forms of physical sexual relations with a patient, clearly sexual abuse. The important thing to remember about this, all of these definitions, is that you can't consent to sexual abuse. So, you know, that doesn't matter at all. If a health professional has sexual intercourse with a patient, that is sexual abuse. The question of consent never arises. And that's because, again, of the power imbalance between a healthcare professional and their patients. So your personal relationships and your professional relationships need to remain distinct. The second definition of sexual abuse is touching of a sexual nature of the patient. So here we see that term sexual nature. And again, that's going to be subject to individual interpretation. And so it's going to be really important, because you carry out procedures every day where you need to be in physical contact with patients, that you describe to them what you need to do and why, and that you get their consent prior to proceeding, because you don't want them interpreting your touch as being of a sexual nature when it is in fact of a clinical nature and it's appropriate to the service being provided. So touching of a sexual nature of a patient is sexual abuse. Finally, and probably the area that is most surprising to folks, is that behavior or remarks of a sexual nature are also considered sexual abuse. So again, you have to go back to the context of what is sexual nature. That's going to be subject to interpretation and subject to individual interpretation in some cases. And so when describing procedures, particularly intimate procedures, which our members do perform, you're going to want to choose language that is medical in nature, not sexual in nature, leaves no innuendo, and is clinically appropriate to what is being done. Which brings us to the next slide. What is not sexual abuse? As you might imagine, when this legislation came in, 21 health professions were under the same umbrella legislation, subject to the same provisions. And many of those health professions are what we call hands-on professions. These are professions that touch their patients as part of their practice. In fact, in some cases, that is all they do. I'm thinking of massage therapy, for instance. So, you know, touch of a sexual nature was quite controversial in the sense that how do we practice our profession and provide the service that we need to provide to the public without running afoul of these definitions. And so it's really important to know that the legislation includes this provision, which is that sexual nature does not include touching, behavior, or remarks of a clinical nature that are appropriate to the service being provided. So that's what has to be in your head. The filter in your head needs to be, is this touch, is this behavior, is this conduct, is my remark appropriate, clinically appropriate to the service being provided? Is it of a clinical nature? Is it appropriate to the service provided? That's the context and filter that needs to be applied to ensure you're doing your part to prevent sexual abuse of patients. So let's talk about some of the risks inherent in an MRIT's practice, or maybe in some cases any for health professionals' practice, that we need to be aware of when we're talking about preventing the sexual abuse of patients. So the first one is fairly obvious, and I've touched upon it already. That is that personal relationships with patients are completely inappropriate. Consent is not an issue in these provisions, and so once again, a patient cannot consent to have sexual intercourse with a health professional. And that is just reflecting the fact that there's such a power imbalance between a health professional and a patient. Patient is always so much more vulnerable that that it's just an inappropriate relationship. Having a personal relationship with a patient is inappropriate. It's also the reason many professions are directed not to treat their family members except in emergency circumstances. Again, you want to keep those personal and professional things separate, and you want to keep professional boundaries with your patients at all times. So one of the biggest risk areas in our profession is the inadequate explanation of procedure, or inadequately explaining or not properly explaining the physical contact that's going to be required for that procedure. So we get complaints from patients about MRITs who are positioning them and touching their body, but have not said anything about why they're doing that or sought consent. And so that is a real problem. You can't just proceed. The patient is a human being with bodily autonomy and has the authority to withdraw their consent at any time. And they can't do that unless you tell them what you're going to do and why. And so if you need to come into physical contact with a patient for any reason, it is important that you explain that to them, explain to them why you need to touch them, where you're going to touch them, and ensure they're okay with that before you proceed. And that extends to anything like leaning on a patient. Sometimes the touch is not, it's inadvertent, but it's inappropriate. So again, if you're going to make contact with a patient's body at any time, you need to speak first, let them know what's going on, and give them the opportunity to say, no, thank you, or can we do this in a different way? I don't want you touching me. I want you giving me verbal instructions instead. Patients will have, again, a variety of comfort levels with what you're doing, and you need to accept that as the professional because you're in the power position in these procedures. Another area of risk for our profession is inadequate gowning and draping. Again, health professionals are comfortable with the human body. It's the work you do. It's your profession. It's clinical, but that's not the case for a patient. A patient coming in is already vulnerable. You don't know if that patient has a past life experience of other abuse or any other traumatic experience that might impact how they feel about being unclothed. And so it's really important that you make sure that the patient is comfortable, understands why they need to remove clothing. Don't ask people to remove clothing they don't need to. That's highly suspicious to any individual and will get you into trouble. You only need to ask them to remove the clothing that's necessary, explain to them why, and provide them with a gown or a drape so that they can feel comfortable and safe through the procedure. And then finally, another area of risk in our profession would be failing to maintain consent. And by that, I mean proceeding through a procedure, doing things without telling the patient what you're doing and getting consent to do them, particularly if those things involve physical contact. And physical contact with your hands or physical contact with an instrument, either way, the patient doesn't know what's happening. You've done this hundreds of times before yourself. They have not. In some cases, this may be their very first time, and they're not familiar with what's going to happen. So make no assumptions about their level of knowledge. Even if they've been through the procedure before, that doesn't mean that they're comfortable with you touching them this time. So you need to make sure that you are explaining that and obtaining consent to make sure that there are no concerns raised about the way that you practice. So, which brings us to our principles of communication and touch. These have been around for a long time. They've served us well. They provide guidance to our members around those issues about communication and touch, because those are the areas that are of the most risk in our profession and that we get the most complaints about. So here are some basic rules to keep you out of trouble. Talk before you touch. Again, let people know if you're going to need to make contact with their body and make sure they're okay with it, and make sure you need to, make sure it's clinically appropriate. Treat all your patients with respect. Every patient comes with an individual life experience, and you don't know what that is. So make no assumptions about their comfort level. Reserve judgment and make no assumptions. There it is right there. Speak directly to your patient, engage with them, connect with them. That's the best way to ensure that you have understanding and consent. Obviously, maintain confidentiality. That's important. And then finally, create a safe environment. And by that, we mean a professional, clinically safe environment so that the patient feels that they are as least vulnerable as possible, because they walk into, to meet you, they're already vulnerable. So do whatever you can to make sure they feel safe and taken care of. Let's turn now to the provisions in the legislation that talk about mandatory reporting. Remember, one of the purposes of these provisions of the legislation was to increase reporting, and that's because it was found that their sexual abuse of patients is quite underreported. And so to encourage reporting, they imposed an obligation on all regulated health professionals who are regulated under the RHPA, and now that's over 200,000 in the province, are required to file a report if they have reasonable grounds obtained in their practice that a patient is being sexually abused by another regulated health professional. So what this says is that if patients are uncomfortable coming forward, which is what the report found, that patients don't feel safe and they don't feel like the college is going to take their concern seriously, another way to increase the information that's coming to the college about this type of conduct or behavior is to require everyone to report it, a bit like child abuse. So health professionals are also required to report suspected child abuse. And it's the same reason. It's because the more information that a regulator can gather, the more likely that they'll be able to do something about that conduct that's happening out there. There are quite substantial fines for failing to make a mandatory report under the RHPA, including failing to make this kind of a report. So that's a little bit alarming and scary for health professionals, which is completely understandable. But let's just demystify that a tiny little bit so that you feel better. Mandatory reporting applies only to your practice. So in other words, this is not information that you obtained at the hockey arena or at the bar or at the social night. This is information that comes to you in your practice. You only have to make a report if you know the health professional's name. So if the patient doesn't disclose that to you or the person doesn't disclose that to you, you can't make a report. You're not to include the patient's name in the report unless you have their written consent to do so. And you may wonder, well, why make a report if the patient's name isn't included? The regulator may have other ways of obtaining that information, and they may have other reports that support that the conduct is going on. So again, you don't know what they already know, and you don't know what else is out there. Finally, you are indemnified for making a report in good faith. And that's because, again, we want to encourage these reports so that regulators can do something about this conduct and hopefully put an end to it. So I hope that's been helpful and useful. As I say, this webinar was put together because we've just launched our revised What You Must Know About Preventing Sexual Abuse, which was sent to you just shortly ago. If you have any questions about any aspect of this particular What You Must Know About or mandatory reporting or sexual abuse in general, please don't hesitate to contact our professional conduct staff. You'll see the contact information there on your screen. So again, I want to thank you very much for taking the time this afternoon to join me and remind you that the time you spend reviewing this webinar and the associated publication is time that you can count in your quality assurance portfolio as a professional development activity. Thanks so much.